The old wooden house creaked and groaned under the weight of the approaching storm. Rain lashed against the windows, each drop a tiny, insistent fist pounding at the glass. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something ancient and unsettling. My grandfather, a man whose stories were as tangled and worn as the roots of the ancient banyan tree in our village, sat by the dim lamplight, his eyes reflecting the flickering flame. He had a way of drawing you into his tales, a hushed reverence in his voice that made even the most mundane events sound like prophecies. Tonight, the usual cheerful chatter was absent, replaced by a heavy silence that felt charged with anticipation. He began, his voice a low rumble. "You know, my child, this land we live on, it holds secrets older than the stones in the temple. Secrets whispered on the wind, carried by the spirits of those who walked before us. And tonight, with the sky weeping and the wind howling like a hungry beast, the veil between worlds grows thin." He paused, letting the wind's wail fill the silence. "Have you ever heard of the Krasu?" The question hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. I had heard hushed whispers, fragments of stories told by the older women in the village, tales meant to scare children into staying indoors after dusk. But never had it been spoken of with such gravity. I shook my head, my heart beginning to thump against my ribs like a trapped bird. My grandfather continued, his gaze fixed on the dancing shadows. "The Krasu, they say, is a woman, or at least she was once. A woman who delved into forbidden arts, seeking power beyond her mortal reach. She found it, but at a terrible cost. Her soul became tethered to a monstrous hunger, a craving for life essence, for the very breath of the living." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Her form changes, you see. By day, she appears as a normal woman, perhaps even beautiful. But when darkness falls, her true nature is revealed. Her head detaches from her body, floating through the night, a grotesque entity with long matted hair and glowing eyes. Her entrails hang like bloody cords, dripping with a vile ichor. She flies on the wind, searching for her prey." A shiver traced its way down my spine, cold and unwelcome. The rain outside seemed to intensify, the wind's mournful cry growing louder, more desperate. "Her hunger," my grandfather continued, his voice laced with a chilling detail, "is not for flesh, but for the life force. She seeks out pregnant women, drawn to the nascent life within them. She will hover outside windows, her glowing eyes piercing through the darkness, seeking to drink the blood and the very essence of the unborn child. Sometimes she will even try to steal it away, leaving the mother weakened, or worse, taking the child before it has a chance to draw its first breath." He drew a shaky breath. "But it's not just the unborn. She preys on the weak, the old, anyone whose life force is already flickering. She can drain the vitality from them, leaving them pale, listless, and eventually lifeless. The villagers, they learned to protect themselves. They would hang thorny branches outside their homes, for the Krasu's flesh is soft and vulnerable, and the thorns would tear at her as she passed. They would leave out red-colored offerings, believing the sight of blood would satiate her for a time, or perhaps confuse her with her own kind." The lamp flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and twist on the walls. I looked around the familiar room, suddenly seeing it with new eyes, a place where unseen horrors might lurk. "There was a story," my grandfather began again, his voice taking on a more personal yet still unsettling tone, "about a young woman named May Noi who lived in a village not too far from here many years ago. She was newly married and she was with child. Her husband, a kind but fearful man, had heard the tales, of course. He did everything he could to protect her. He barred the windows, lit every lamp, and kept May Noi close. But one night, The storm was as fierce as this one, and the wind seemed to mock their efforts. The lamps flickered, and for a moment, just a moment, the house was plunged into darkness. He paused, and I held my breath, waiting. The storm outside raged, mirroring the tempest in my own heart. May Noi woke up feeling a strange chill, he said, his voice barely audible. She felt a presence, a heavy, suffocating stillness in the air, despite the howling wind. She opened her eyes, and in the dim light, she saw it. A pair of glowing red eyes hovering just outside her window. They were not the eyes of any animal she knew. They were ancient, full of a malevolent hunger. And then she saw it. The head, detached, floating, with long, dark hair trailing behind it like a shroud. Her own hair stood on end, and a scream, choked and silent, was trapped in her throat. My grandfather's voice grew rough. The head drifted closer, and May Noi could see the grotesque face, the snarling mouth, the sharp, elongated tongue. It was reaching for her child. She felt a sudden sharp pain, a searing sensation as if something invisible had latched onto her. She could feel her strength draining away, her very life force being siphoned off. She tried to move, to cry out, but her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. Her husband, he continued, his voice regaining some of its earlier strength, though terrified, remembered what his own grandmother had told him. He grabbed a bunch of thorny branches, the sharpest he could find, and flung open the window, shouting a curse he had learned. The head recoiled, and with a shriek that was more like the tearing of silk than a human sound, it retreated into the darkness. May Noi collapsed, weak and trembling, but the child within her, though weakened, was still alive. He looked at me, his eyes deep and serious. The next morning, May Noi was frail, but she survived. The villagers found the head of a wild boar near her house, its throat torn to shreds. They knew then that the thorns had done their work, but they also knew that the Krasu, though wounded, had escaped. She would be back, for her hunger is insatiable. But the worst, my grandfather's voice dropped again, a chilling finality to it, was what happened to her husband. He had been so brave, so protective. But in his fear, in his desperation, he had forgotten one thing. The Krasu is not just a creature of the night. She is a woman. And sometimes she is the woman you know, the woman you love. A sudden gust of wind rattled the shutters violently, making me jump. The lamplight wavered, casting a wild dance of shadows. May Noi, after that night, was never quite the same. She became withdrawn. Her eyes held a perpetual fear. And her husband? He began to change too. He grew pale. His once vibrant energy seemed to fade. He would stare at May Noi with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. A mixture of love, fear, and something else, something hungry. My grandfather's gaze drifted towards the window, as if seeing something I could not. One night, he simply disappeared, no trace, no sign. Some said he had wandered off in his delirium, lost to the jungle. But the wise ones, the ones who remembered the old ways, they knew. They knew that May Noi, in her weakened state, had become a conduit, a vessel for the Krasu's power. And in her husband's fading life force, she had found a new sustenance. He let the words sink in, the silence that followed more deafening than any sound. The storm outside seemed to be subsiding, but the unease within the house had only intensified. The Krasu is not a fairy tale, my grandfather said, his voice now a weary whisper. She is a warning, a reminder of the darkness that can reside within the human heart and the ancient evils that still linger in the shadows of our world. They say she is
drawn to places where the balance is broken, where fear takes root. And tonight, With the storm raging and the whispers of the past stirring, I feel her presence. I feel the ancient hunger stirring. He coughed, a dry, rasping sound that sent another tremor through me. So, remember, my child, when the wind howls and the rain lashes down, and you hear a strange rustling outside your window, or see a pair of glowing eyes in the darkness, be vigilant, for the monsters of our legends are not always as far away as you might think. Sometimes they are closer than the skin on your bones. He fell silent, and the only sound was the dying wind and the drip, drip, drip of water from the eaves. I looked at my grandfather, his face etched with the weariness of age and the weight of the stories he carried. And in the dim lamplight, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of red in his eyes, a fleeting glint that mirrored the glowing orbs of the Krasu, and a cold dread, far deeper than any fear of the storm, settled upon me. The house creaked again, and for the first time it sounded less like the settling of old wood and more like the slow, deliberate movement of something ancient and terrible awakening. The story was over, but the horror, I knew, had just begun to truly sink in. The very air in the room felt different, charged with a palpable sense of dread, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the first hint of dawn, or perhaps for something far more sinister to emerge from the encroaching darkness. The house creaked again, and for the first time it sounded less like the settling of old wood and more like the slow, deliberate movement of something ancient and terrible awakening. The story was over, but the horror, I knew, had just begun to truly sink in. The very air in the room felt different, charged with a palpable sense of dread, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the first hint of dawn, or perhaps for something far more sinister to emerge from the encroaching darkness. The memory of my grandfather's words, of the detached head and the glowing eyes, would forever be etched in my mind, a chilling reminder that some legends are not meant to remain buried in the past, but are destined to stalk the present, waiting for the opportune moment to reveal their horrifying truth. The world outside, now hushed by the subsiding storm, seemed strangely silent, as if holding its own secrets, its own lurking terrors, just beyond the reach of human perception. And in that profound silence, I could still feel the phantom chill of the Krasu's breath, a breath that promised not just death, but the utter annihilation of the very essence of life. The house was no longer a sanctuary, but a fragile shell against the ancient, insatiable hunger that now seemed to have awakened within its very foundations, a hunger that was as old as the land itself and as relentless as the night.